Dr. Jazz.
Cool. John, thanks for taking the time. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, man. Thanks for having me.
You know, I've been a fan for such a long time. Being a guitarist, you know, you've played with Monder and Scofield and all these guys, and well, that's how I found out about your name, you know, just like taking those guys, and then I checked, of course, the other records, and I was like, man, he's an incredible player, and you know, I love what you've been doing for the last 30 years, I guess, more even.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And I always loved your compositions, by the way, you know, on all those record possibilities and with Scofield. And I listened to the last one, Stranger Than Fiction, and man, you know, they're so complex. They have really amazing structures. It's like a movie always. Your tune, I think, you know, some head and like go somewhere. And I will just start our talk with you as a composer. Specifically, first, like for Stranger Than Fiction, how did you write this one? Because it's like really complex and in general, I mean, what's your process when writing?
I think I don't have one process, but I remember when I was studying with Phil Woods towards the latter part of high school, and he said, I want you to get in the habit of composing. And so I teach composition at my school, the University of Manitoba, and that's the way I kind of like try to think about it. I know some people had studied with Miguel Zenon, and he said something similar. And obviously Miguel's an incredible player, incredible writer, really important contributor. I think, you know, you want it to become part of your day and part of what you're doing. And at this point in my life, I think I succeed certain times better than others with that, you know, but I am planning another large ensemble project, and some of the pieces are written, some of the pieces I'm working on. I mean, back in the day, it was exclusively at the piano, where I would just go to the piano. And I know there were certain pieces that I wrote in the mid to late 90s where like I would just make time and they would kind of come, you know?
Yeah.
I spent one time, a friend of mine is a great piano player named Bill Mays. I spent like 9 days watching his cabin. I was taking care of his dog, and I stayed out at his cabin in Pennsylvania. This would have been like September of '92, and it was just so beautiful out there. But I think it's the only time in my life that I literally was playing music more than 12 hours a day, like you know, just practicing, you know. And he had this beautiful Steinway piano, and I was reading Bernstein's series of 6 lectures, The Unanswered Question. And so I was just in this really great creative phase. And I wrote several pieces just during those 9 days. One was Waking Dream, one's called Along the Way. I think there's 1 or 2 others. So it was always at the piano. And whereas over time, I did the BMI Jazz Composers Workshop, which I actually just had a piece read by them last week, which was interesting. Because I'd love to do a big band project, but of course, you know, that is not easy or inexpensive. But I did the BMI Jazz Composers Workshop in the 90s with Manny Album and Jim McNeely. And one of the concepts that they introduced to me that was completely foreign to me was this idea of pitch cells. I was aware of tone rows, like a 12-tone row, but I wasn't aware of like, well, what if you just take 3, 4, 5, or even 2 notes in sequence and build something from that? And then I started to realize, and at first I didn't understand it or relate to it. And then I studied with Jim privately a couple of years later, and I started to get a better idea about it. And of course, so many great pieces of music are built from something small.
Sure.
Where I think sometimes my instinct was this sort of stream of consciousness thing, which sometimes you get something kind of cool, and sometimes you get a bunch of unrelated ideas that, you know. I remember when I had a conversation like this with Maria Schneider, I asked her about her process, and she said, I get these little ideas, what she was telling me, and this was like, I had this conversation with her, I believe in 2006 or 7 at her old place on 72nd Street. And it was like she just had an upright piano and she would put little Post-its, you know, of like little things where she'd tape, you know, here's an idea. And over time, and I've had that process as well, you know, where it's like,
actually.
I got a thing and I write this down and then something feels good under my fingers. And then slowly there's some connectivity that correlates in a way that you're not fully conscious of, but it's like, okay, there's some kind of inherent sense there. And, but that process of thinking about pitch cells and tone rows and I remember the thing that really interested me about it was it allowed, you know, whatever you were doing to have an inherent sense of continuity that it wouldn't have otherwise. Even if you weren't specifically intending for it. You know, if you're building something from a second, well, the inversion of a second is a seventh. And you know what I mean? And it just, it gave it an extra layer of logic that it wouldn't have had otherwise. So that's one of the processes that I think about and use as a composer.
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, you know, when I write music, like, how do you get fresh ideas? Like, you know, sometimes I get stuck as a writer, you know, or maybe that's not even bad, but you know, you write stuff and then you come up with another 7/4 riff. And then I feel like, okay, I've written like 7 of those already. Maybe it's not bad if it's another one, I guess, but sometimes I contemplate on these things like, okay, shit, it's another one of these. Like, how do you solve these problems if you have them, or like, how do you keep it fresh?
Well, I don't think there's one answer. I mean, I remember when I was 21, and I included this in a book that got published a couple years ago of like stories from musicians.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that actually also later. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I met Jon Gordon when I was 21, you know, and I met him at Rainbow Studio, where so many of the great ECM records were recorded, with Jan Erik Konskog, and he was going to record our project. And and man, you know, Jan was so great. He was so nice and supportive and friendly and humble, you know, and I was just getting to know his music. I mean, I knew a little bit of some of the stuff with Keith Jarrett, but I knew some people, even though there were very trad jazz kind of folks that found me as a teenager in New York and brought me over and got me on some gigs and things, but they had a lot of the ECM records, and I started listening, and there was a record of him with a children's choir. There was a record with him with it was like a giant harp on a beach, a wind harp, so this kind of improvised thing, you know. And I said, man, where do you come up with your concepts for what you're doing? He said, man, every day I get up, I listen to Johnny Hodges and Ben Webster. My all-time favorite saxophone player is Eddie Lockjaw Davis. And so I was very inspired that Jan went to the tradition, right? So I love the tradition, you know, I love being connected to that. But I mean, I've always loved like Late Train. I love Weather Report. You mentioned guitar players. I'm a huge Alan Holdsworth fan. I had a friend of mine, and you know, early on in college, play me some Alan Holdsworth. I love Alan Holdsworth. Oh my God,
such a fan, man. I'm like, yeah.
You're a fan of his?
Oh man, come on. It's like,
I mean, like,
yeah, sure.
I remember, like, I think about it now. Like, I think about the lines that guy plays and the technical mastery. It's almost like, if you think about him kind of in the 80s into the 90s, it's almost like what the beboppers were hearing in Art Tatum, you know, that kind of incredible technical mastery, like you could play any note at any time, you know, and make it work, you know, and create tonalities, create the freeness of creating tonalities and tension release in places in such magical, personal, original ways. So I think, you know, it's almost like you said, I'm giving you a long-winded answer.
No, please.
But like, you know, recently for a student, I introduced him to the Berg Piano Sonata, the Opus 1, by Alban Berg. And of the guys in that school, you know, Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern, for whatever reason, Alban Berg is always the one that I related to his music a little bit more, or a few more of his pieces. And I tend to really, I find with a lot of the 20th century composers, their early works really get me.
Yep.
Like Bartók, the first violin concerto, the Adagio movement, and it starts, the melody is "I can't get started," only starting in D.
Yeah.
You know, and I heard that, like a friend of mine had made me a cassette. He said the 3 Bs, Brecker, Berganzi, and Bartók. It was like,
that's a nice company.
Some Brecker with Don Grolnick. It was some live Jerry Berganzi. And then I get to the end of the tape and I hear this solo violin playing the first 7 or 8 notes of "I Can't Get Started" by Vernon Duke. And I was like, what is this? And then I just realized, oh, well, of course, Vernon Duke also had a side hustle, and you know, it was also a classical composer, and was, you know, very well schooled in that. And so there's another piece by Rachmaninoff that has almost the same melody as well. So, but so I was, and I just started to transcribe the piece as best I could at that time, and I was fascinated by it. And you know, a lot of what I know about counterpoint is just, you know, from transcribing a few things. But I think I have pretty varied influences, and there's so much music that I love, you know, like all of us, man, you know, we listen to so much stuff. Yeah, I mean, I don't know why it comes, maybe because we were talking about you're in Slovenia, not too far away, but I just think about Bartók and was it Kodai, I believe, that in the early 1900s, maybe you know about this, but they were going out and like scouring the hills and going to people, like learning about their folk music, you know, and then they brought that into what they were doing. So yeah, I mean, I just think those are some of the things that help me get out of a rut, or just having very, you know,
I mean, important too.
Yeah, having a lot of varied influences. And I think sometimes for certain jazz students of mine, I'm surprised they don't know more about classical music, or it's like they took classical history, and I'm like, man, you know, first time I heard Mahler's First when I was like 13 or 14 years old, I lost my mind. So I don't know that music as well as I know what we do as jazz musicians, but to me, I mean,
still you know, dipped your feet in it, and
you got to know. I mean, you know, Billy Strayhorn knew about that music.
Sure.
You know, Duke knew about, you know, I mean, that was so. So I think being aware of that is very helpful.
Yeah, especially like Stranger Than Fiction. I noticed this, since it's a larger ensemble, all these different stories, you know, in the pieces. Like, because in a smaller ensemble, it's more like a jazz treatment, if you know what I mean. Like, I'll put it like that. But like in this one, you really stretched it, I think. And but how did you come up? I know you did, like, the previous one already was a larger one, you know, evolution, but like one of the previous ones. But like this larger ensemble, what is it about this one? I mean, it seems to really work for you, or like when I listen to it, you must really like it in a sense.
I do. I mean, you know, I used to sub quite a bit with the Vanguard Jazz Orchestra, and then playing so much of Thad's music and Jim McNeely's music.
Oh, wow.
I know one of my pieces, well, before you ask where Stranger Than Fiction came from, but there's a piece of mine I remember called Currents, and I was playing like in the early 90s or something with the Vanguard. Maybe it was mid 90s, and there's a piece of Jim McNeely's called Absolution. And I just had this thing, it was similar kind of intro, and to this piece I wrote called Currents. And so, but you know, Jim's music is incredible. Thad is one of the all-time great big band writers. I used to play quite a bit with Maria Schneider. I remember the first time I did a gig with her, like I did a jazz cruise in '91, and you know, there was a few musicians like that, like sitting next to Mark Turner and doing something and just saying like, okay, all right, I see where this, you know. And the first time I played Maria's music, I was just like, okay, this is a profound artist that has
clear vision. Yeah.
great stories to tell us. Yeah, you know. So I just think I've heard a lot of music that I'm inspired by, and I do love to write, but I didn't, you know, I didn't start out thinking I was going to write for large ensembles. I was just writing,
Okay.
and then some of the things that were like a melody, a counter line, and a bass line, or three lines. You know, you double that. You know, you got six. You know what I mean? So add
Yeah.
water,
Suddenly.
add
Yeah.
a rhythm section, you got a nonette, you know. So some of the things are as simple as that, and then some of them are um, um, maybe a slightly more conventional, you know. But yeah, I enjoy it, and I just feel like that's where a good part of my work and growth has been,
Mm.
you know, in recent years is writing for those kinds of ensembles.
Yeah. How did you know? I did this interview, like also with Alan Ferber, a couple of weeks ago, and you know he's also, especially kind of like Nonette, this smaller. He's one of the greats, you know, in the last 20 years, and I know he's in this one as well. Like, did you guys? I think he arranged also two tunes, right? Like, did you guys
He,
talk
he
about?
did. He started. I met Alan at the old knitting factory in 2002. And I guess he and his brother Mark had just maybe gotten to New York not too soon before that, but he said he'd met me at the Jazz Bakery when I was playing out there. I don't know if it was T.S. Monk's group or Mike Holliber or somebody.
Hmm.
And he started, so we did a couple things together. He started calling me to play in his nonette in '06 or '07. And so then I was planning a large ensemble record, but not a full-on big band record. And I really loved what Alan was doing and loved playing in that group, you know? And I said, look, man, and at the time, I was very, what would you say? I bought a computer in '99. I was trying to learn Finale. It crashed, like, of no, like, you know, like it was just, I was on the bed. The dog moved. It was nothing, or, you know, it's just like, and it just said all files corrupted. I'd been studying with a student of mine to learn, and I just thought, oh my God, you know, so I was a little bit late to things like Finale and Sibelius. So I said to Alan, I asked him if he would help me in terms of the instrumentation. I had the pieces and I had the
Yeah.
discussion. I just said, well, I want this instrument here, this instrument here. So he helped me, he took some notes, and so he was very instrumental in that. The pieces were pretty much done. I wrote the string parts such as they were, and incorporated vocals and percussion. So that was kind of like a nonette plus. But so that was the beginning of us working together, and you know, in that way. I mean, I had already done maybe one project of his, and then I've done a couple since, I guess. But yeah, he was a lot of help because, and I remember there was another student of mine, Jay Ratman. I met him, he was like a teenager. I was doing a duo gig with Charlap at the Deerhead Inn like 20 years ago. And he came up and he said, hey, my name's Jay, and here's a bunch of your solos that I transcribed. I was like, oh, wow, that's great. That's really nice to meet you. So could I get a lesson sometime? He said, sure. And I said, oh, so these are really nice. It looks like you must know Finale or Sibelius. And he said, yes. I said, I'm going to come and take lessons with you. So he went to Manhattan School of Music. I think he did both his undergrad and his master's. I may have subbed there with him a couple of times. I used to teach there a good bit for Rich Perry and Steve Wilson and different people. But around the time that he finished up there, I was getting ready to go back and do my master's. And I don't know, this was maybe like 13 years ago or something. And I said, hey man, could I remember when I said I was going to call you and ask you for some lessons? Can you teach me how to write, you know, Sibelius and all
That's
that?
so
So that was the beginning of that process. It was maybe around the time that Evolution came out, because I just realized, okay, if I'm going to be writing for larger ensembles, I have to. So Jay was a big help. There's also another student of mine at Purchase named Dan Glode that helped me some, and Alan helped me some, but I think Alan's more of a Finale guy. But yeah, so that was, you know, I used very, very similar personnel to his nonette for what I was doing. And then for the more recent project that we did in Winnipeg, I used like local folks that I play with up there that are a combination of faculty members and or former
Okay.
faculty, former students, and some faculty are also former students. And then John Ellis played bass clarinet and some
Yeah, I love
stuff.
that.
Anna
Yeah.
Blackmore, two students played. Anna's a former student. Two former students, Reginald Lewis and Tristan Martinuson, played tenor. And Derrick Gardner was at the time was still a faculty member. He played trumpet, and Larry Roy played some guitar. Jocelyn Gould, who's a big star,
Yeah, no, yeah,
in
she's really good.
yeah, you know about Jocelyn?
Yeah, she just didn't she play on her latest record? Who just came out, right? With Rodney Whitaker and
I never heard it. Somebody did some. Yeah, I never heard it. I just did a couple hours one day in the studio with a great band with Quincy Davis. And Rodney Whitaker. But anyway, so that was that thing. And so the next project, I don't even know what it's going to be, but I know next fall it's going to be somewhere between nonet, tentet, and big band.
Okay.
I may have some choir because at one point I was doing some stuff with choir up there. But I kind of like a lot of different colors and textures.
Yeah.
Sometimes it makes the music a little bit more difficult to identify, or, it's like I come from a very strong bebop tradition, but I love everything, right? And one of my heroes is Scott Robinson. I'm sure you must be hip to Scott Robinson.
Sure, I love him. Yeah.
Scott plays everything.
Well,
like on
underrated guys, man. Like,
just a genius.
Yeah.
I like projects that are like that have a lot of contrast and a lot of different colors and textures. So it will probably be another large ensemble that has some of those kinds of things.
Yeah, I love this. What you started with smaller groups and now you're doing this larger nonet kind of Lee Konitz vibe in a modern way. Like it's so cool. I mean, I was really positively surprised when I heard it. I was like, man, this sounds killing. And I love John Ellis, that he's present. He's like in Alan's group as well, and it's like kind of
I love John. John's one of my favorites.
So cool.
Yeah.
So cool. But I wanted to ask you, John, about you mentioned Phil Woods, and I know you guys had a really strong connection, and like how did this begin? Actually, you were like what, 16 or 18 when you met him? Like, where does your story with Phil begin?
Well, in the middle of sophomore year in high school, it was shortly after I turned 16, a good buddy of mine, wonderful saxophone player named Jay Rodriguez, we were at Performing Arts High School together. And I guess he was like 2 years, he was a freshman, I was a sophomore, me and another sophomore, Curtis Haywood, we went out to his house. And Jay was like a year and a half younger than me because I'm like late December birthday. But he was already studying with Paquito. And he knew Paquito. I think Paquito lived not too far from his place in Jersey. And he played me and Curtis a bunch of Paquito records, which we loved. And then he played me Phil. And something went off in my head as a kid of like, because I was playing a lot of classical saxophone, but that wasn't really my sound that I was hearing. And while I didn't really understand certain things, I was playing the Charlie Parker Omnibook and I loved it. But I don't think I understood the recordings. Like I heard these old scratchy recordings and it didn't make as much sense.
Yeah.
When I heard Phil, I started to put it together. And then over time I realized, oh, well, I mean, Bird was really the genius that created it and is actually much more complex than, I mean, as much as I love Phil and people like Sonny Stitt or Jackie McLean or Lee Konitz, I mean, Bird was, was much more complex and innovative, obviously, but it was almost like Phil and Stitt and guys like that, or Dexter, to me, when I could hear that, my ear could catch on to it. And then I went back and I was like, oh, because there's all this other stuff here that I was getting into on the page, like playing a classical piece, right? And then I started to say like, oh, wow. And, you start to understand the heaviness of it. But so I heard Phil and I just kind of lost my mind. Like I think a lot of alto players in the 70s and 80s, I guess this was like early 1983 or something. And the next, like about a year, so I got a bunch of Phil records, and I got a book of Phil Wood solos, and I was just, along with the Charlie Parker Omni book, and then I'm really losing my mind for Cannonball and all the great alto players, Stitt, you know. And my friend's mom was a big jazz fan at school, and she saw me one night at the parent-teacher conference in like November of '84. Or no, I guess it was, no, it had to be November of '83. So she said, I heard you play saxophone and you're into jazz. You should come with me to some clubs sometimes. I'm like, great. Now I was 16, right? So I couldn't go to any of these places on my own. There was a girl I was in junior high with named Denise Dicey. Her dad had a blues jam session at a place called Dan Lynch on 14th and 2nd. And I went there with her a few times, and that was really cool. There was some great musicians there, but I mean, I was 13, right? So, I mean, I'm just, you know, so the first thing I heard live at 16 years old, I went to 7th Avenue South.
Ooh, okay.
It was the Art Taylor Quartet. Arthur Taylor, great drummer. Ron Carter was playing bass. Branford, who I believe was 22 or 23, was playing tenor. And Clark Terry was playing trumpet.
Oh, man. Ooh.
And at the end of the night, he sang mumbles. And I like hearing like the first live jazz you've ever heard in your life. And I see Clark singing mumbles at the end. I thought I was having like an out of body experience.
Oh, sure.
Like, this is happening every night in New York. A couple of nights later, the Gil Evans big band was played Monday nights there. Because, you know, it's always been the Monday night thing in New York for big bands. And so we go back, Margaret and I meet David Sanborn, who's playing with Gil. And it was a great band. Lou Soloff came and hung with us, Mark Egan.
Oh, wow, beautiful.
Oh, man. Great keyboard player. It's going to drive me crazy. The bass player that plays with Peter Gabriel is the brother of the keyboard player that was working with.
Levin, Pete Levin.
Yes, Tony Levin is the bass player.
And
anyway, I'm spacing on his brother, great keyboard player. And I met all these people.
Pete Levin, right?
Pete Levin, thank you, Pete Levin.
Yeah.
Howard Johnson was playing tuba and baritone saxophone.
Crazy.
And I went up and started talking to Sanborn, and man, Dave is just the nicest guy, man. He talked to me. And then this is one of the stories I told in the book. Like, I'm there like in like jeans and a t-shirt, and I got like my book bag and my horn. He's like, hey man, I got a split. Can you finish the gig for me? And I went up to Gil Evans as a 16-year-old kid. And he just looked at me like, Lou Soloff always loved the story. He just went like, I just looked me up and down, you know, like, because I was 16, I probably looked like I was 12. He's like, he was really nice to me, but he's like, I can't really take a chance on you. I was like, that's fine. I'll just go back and sit down and listen. I had a good old time, but you know, but I was having, and then soon after that, I heard Phil, and hearing Phil live was like mind blowing. And Tom Harrell was in the band at the time, man. And Tom was just, I mean, that's some of the greatest trumpet playing I've ever heard live.
Yeah, he's incredible. Yeah.
And not too long after that, I started to hear Charles McPherson live. And Charles is also one of my big heroes. And I'm super lucky, man, because both Phil and Charles completely like took me under their wings and spent time with me and were so kind and so generous. So I'm really lucky, man. I had a lot of great people that were very, very kind. And there was a lot of other musicians around at that time. Like, I used to sit in every Saturday with a great tenor player named Eddie Chambly at Sweet Basil's. It was a brunch gig on Saturday afternoons from 2 to 6. Sometimes I played with Doc Cheatham on Sundays too. One of my musical fathers was Eddie Chambly. That was also thanks to my friend Margaret. She said, oh, you should go sit in with Eddie Chambly. And so I did that for years. And then Eddie Locke sometimes played with Doc Cheatham. And man, you know, like, so even though simultaneously, like, my friends are like, I'm hearing Chicory 3 quartets and Late Train, and I'm starting to get introduced to Ellen Holdsworth. I was like, man, Doc Cheatham's got some magic, man.
The tradition,
you know?
yeah.
Yeah, like, and so it's like I just believe it's real important to respect that and to know where you come from and show, really show respect, not just, not
Yeah.
just give word to it, but really. So I love that. I'm very lucky that a lot of those kind of people like took time with me and were very generous with me.
Mm. So was it then easy like this, entering the New York scene? I mean, I have that album by Ron McClure. What was it? Sunburst. And you started playing with all these different players like Mike Ladon and entering slowly the New York scene. How was that transition like for you? Like making
Well, I mean,
yourself a name?
I don't know. I grew up in New York, right? And I grew up, come from Staten Island and went to
Yeah.
performing arts high school. So I was around players fairly early, and Eddie Locke that said, "I want you to go play a session with my friend Mike Ladon. He's a little older than you, but he's a lot younger than me, and he'd be good for you." And I learned a lot from Mike. I still do. I love Mike.
Yeah.
And I love the way his music has, he was always coming from the tradition, but the way he's assimilated kind of McCoy and what he
Yeah.
does, I mean, I love it, man, because it's like, you see, and I felt this when I saw Joe Henderson live as a kid, like you hear the whole history of what they do. I feel
Yeah.
like that with Joe Lovano, you hear the whole history, but there's no limitation,
Yeah.
and so I love hearing musicians that are like that. But yeah, so Eddie Locke sent me to Ladon. I can't remember how I met Ron McClure, but and then that led to I believe Leanne Ledgerwood was on that, and then I did some stuff with Leanne, and she started calling me to sub for her at the New School along with Lauren Schoenberg. Lauren Schoenberg had a big impact on me too, because he used to call me. Went to Manhattan School of Music together. He was a returning student there. And from working with Lauren, I got to play a bunch of times with Mel Lewis and Dick Katz and so many great people. Danny Bank, the great baritone player, Eddie Burt, Bobby Pring on trombone. Oh man, the great trombonist that played with Duke. I'm spacing on his name. So many great people, and then there was a number of great saxophone players. Doug Lawrence, man. Great lead alto player Wilson, Chuck Wilson, Steve Wilson played that band a lot. Kent Plowski. So I mean, I had this I think I had a lot of experience with great musicians coming out of the tradition, and that just kept leading to experiences, and I was just kind of growing and
and expanding,
learning and expanding.
Yeah. You've done so much as a band leader, and I have like quite a lot of your records actually, but there's one which I wanted to ask you beginnings and endings. I've never heard it, but like it's with European musicians, and you're like what, 22? Like how did that one happen, and how come? What's this?
I was 21 and
21 even. Oh.
Yeah. All I can say is, there's certain records I did in my 20s that I want to, I mean, those guys were great. Rainbow Studio was great. I'm super thankful to everybody that gave me that opportunity. We had a couple issues. The piano, one person in the band got ill and he had to be replaced at the last minute. And then there was a mistake, like something got lost in the studio, and like we really only had one day as opposed to two, and then some music got lost. They said, but the bass player and drummer are going to be here, and a different piano player would come in, and you could have an hour to try to replace those two tunes that got lost. So it was like, it was tough. Yeah. I had just switched horns. Listen, I was young, I was green, and I'm very thankful that people took a chance on me, and hopefully it was just part of my growth process. But to be completely honest with you, I mean, I don't think I can listen to anything of my own that I did other than like occasional brief things here or there before I was 30. I just think
really
there was
interesting.
a lot of, oh yeah.
Even that is like Witness with Mark, or on Crisscross or
The writing
Ask
was
Me Now?
okay. The writing was okay.
Oh,
You know, there's,
interesting.
you know, but yeah, you know, you just live and learn and try to try to move forward and stay,
Interesting. Wow.
you know,
Hmm.
try to stay positive. I could, yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, it's just a learning process with
Sure.
some of those.
Sure.
But what I always say to friends and students is like, whatever you do at the beginning, your records, the third, fourth, and fifth recording that you do is going to be a lot better from wherever you started, and you're going to learn lessons of like, oh, this is what I need to do in the studio. Oh, this is the kind of read. Oh, this is how close I need to be with the mic. This is the kind of mic I
Yeah.
need to use.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of things like that. And as long as you're dealing with a studio and an engineer that will, you know, like I really love the Kent Heckman and Red Rock Studios in Pennsylvania. Everything I've ever done there, I really like the sound. I like the, you know, he uses Neumann microphones that I can get a little distance from.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, you know, something that's for me that works a little better, and that's yeah. So at any rate, but yeah, I mean, some of the early ones I would chalk up to more of a learning experience, and just it was kind that people
I know
were
what you mean. I know
gave
what
me
you
a
mean.
chance to grow.
Yeah. But was it hard for you to become a band leader? I mean, or was that a natural process? I mean, like,
Well, that particular week, I will tell you, was not easy. My bags got lost. I had no
okay.
clothes or music for a week at the Oslo Jazz Festival, and I couldn't rehearse with the band. And then, like I said, one guy
Yeah.
had to be replaced like day of, and stuff got lost, and it was stressful. But I mean, I just think the idea of like being a band leader, I mean, I'm going on 35 years now of doing it, right? So,
Yeah.
I don't know, man. I would just say this, whatever I know or don't know or can or can't do, I've been around some great band leaders, you know, and I've gotten to play with a lot of really good people. And so hopefully I've just assimilated some of that. But what I do think, the one thing that comes to mind at this moment when you ask about being a band leader is I think about things that have happened in the studio with great musicians.
Mhm.
You know, I'm thinking of tempo and Bill Stewart's like, I'm thinking of it here. It's like, wow, that sounds great. Yeah. You know, Bill Stewart, right? It's like,
Yeah.
or,
Yeah.
you know, John Scofield's has an idea, or Mark Turner has an idea, or Tim Higgins has an idea, or Bill Charlap has an idea, or Billy Drummond's like, hey man, can I start this one? Please, you know,
Yeah.
Billy, you know.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
it's like when you have that kind of thing, that's the thing. Like I just think like maybe you have a concept of something as a band leader, but to the extent that you can make space for great
Yeah.
musicians, or
Yeah.
if they have an idea,
Sure.
like just let them, you know, or I remember Adam Cruz, you know, being a part of certain things, or Ed Simon. I mean, I
Yeah.
love
The
those
currents.
guys,
Yeah. I
right?
love that one. Yeah.
So it's just like, or Alan Ferber, or, you know, or Ellis, or, you know, people like that, where it's like, well, what do you think about this? Or like, yeah, because first of all, I would not have thought of that. Second of all, they're in their comfort zone and they're making a contribution. The music is then becoming something I would never have thought. You know what I mean? It's like this
Yeah.
thing
No.
that's,
No. Sure.
and so that's what's beautiful about, you know, a small group. And I think, I think that's what you were kind of alluding to before. Well, with large ensemble, it's more like the composer and arranger. With small ensemble, it's, to me, in a perfect world, I'd like to have the best of both worlds,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So, do you write much?
Yeah, I do. Too much. Yeah, I mean, I used to. Now I got the last 1 year or somehow this problem of repeating. I don't know, or just I wrote too much maybe. Then, but yeah, writing more simpler stuff. That's where in a phase I am now. Just having a G chord and put an A note over it, and it sounds beautiful, you know, like, wow, that's a 9 over a G, you know.
Yeah.
it can be in 4/4, not it doesn't have to be 11, or I don't know. It's just
That's the thing. I think a lot of people, and
bizarre.
I never caught that bug. I think also because I'm not super, like playing in 11 was not my thing as much, but sometimes now it's like it anything can become cliche, right?
Yeah,
So it's like if some people, if it's not 5'7", 11 or something, it's not hip. And it's like, well, no, that's a hip choice, but it's like anything else. If you keep repeating it, it
then
doesn't have the
it's
same meaning.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I remember talking with Ben Monder and my friend Fabio Ragnelli that played drums on the last record, and I teach with up at University of Manitoba. He's got these books of Paul Motion's compositions, and
Oh
and
man,
Monder was like, man, like he's
I've
magic.
been
He said,
playing those all the time the last 3 months. The
yeah,
promotions. It's incredible.
yeah, yeah. It's like Ben said that Paul claimed to not know anything, but he just has some magic in how he put the thing together, because Ben played with him with
Yeah.
several different groups, and or a couple different, I believe. And then Fabio had these books, and so we were playing them a little bit. I don't know them well, but I really, that trio with
Oh,
Lovano and
that's one of my
Frizzell,
favorite groups ever.
well,
That's
certainly one of my favorite groups I ever saw live.
mm,
And it was interesting. I mentioned Billy Drummond before, and he had invited me a couple times to come out to his house in Jersey to play duo. This is like 20 years ago.
oh wow. Yeah.
And we were talking about getting a gig or something. And I mean, I'd hired Billy on a few things, and he said, who I really love, man, is Monder. I said, oh, I love Ben. I mean, Ben, I played with Ben at Augie's like in 1984, 85 or whatever, when I was 17.
Seriously?
And
Wow.
oh yeah, yeah, Augie's,
Wow.
which is now Smoke. I remember when
Yeah.
that changed, and it was like, but and he was just always this brilliant, completely original guy, and
Yeah.
like just great person as well, and funny, like very,
Yeah,
very
I know.
funny,
Yeah. Yeah.
And and then I think me and Billy were saying, man, we should just play duo, or just play trio. And I can't remember if we actually rehearsed, but we went in the studio in either '05 or '06, and we just did a day in the studio. And then I had this other trio. And then I did like another thing with organ with Gary Versace and Mark Ferber.
Mm.
But like I did like 3 or 4 different little trio dates. And those two things came out on 2 records called The Things You Are, which was essentially all standards and a couple of free pieces, and Within Worlds, which was more about the compositions. That was sort of return to, just writing these pieces, and so anyway, but certainly Paul Motion's trio was a big inspiration for that group with Ben and Billy. So
Yeah, just the compositions, man. I sometimes, we jam. I invite a drummer or saxophone player, and then we played the other day one tune. I forgot, Etude, and it's like a D minor kind of vamp vibe, and then in the head, always like an F sharp appears. So that's like, it cannot work, but it works, and it's just like, how? And it's just like all these incredible, really.
It's almost like, I can't remember exactly how Ben described it. He said, like, Paul said he doesn't really know, like he's not studied, but I think in talking about it, to me, it's almost like Monk, where if the beginning, the tune Ugly Beauty.
Sure, yeah.
So there's a little intro, and the intro is basically that first chord, which I think most people think of as a D half diminished chord, but it's actually D, A, and then A flat G. So you've got a flat fifth, and the 11th.
Yeah.
And so I think, and Monk was the genius at creating that kind of that a certain kind of tension in the music, you know. But at the same time, you go back and look at like scores from Birth of the Cool, and you know, a couple of those Mulligan charts had very similar things where it's like a minor chord with a major third or a dominant chord with a major seven. And I remember seeing that freshman year at Manhattan School of Music in La Valse by oh God, is it Debussy or Ravel? I can't remember off the top of my head. I think maybe it's Ravel, but like in the context of the piece, it doesn't sound or feel like a wrong note as much. But da 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 dee da do da dip, like right on that thing on Godchild. You know, you're just going up, it's just a major scale going up, and then every now and then in 2 or 3 places there's like a funky note in the alto or in the French horn, but it's purposeful, but it just it happens quickly and it creates this other level of tension. Yeah. And so those guys were studying that, and so I think that's, you know, that's that thing in Monk's music. I think it's in Paul's music.
Also.
I mentioned Art Tatum before. Like, I think there's some of that in Tatum too, where he was playing things you would never imagine, you know, like a D major chord, 1-5-3 in his left hand, and then outlining, you know, something where all of a sudden he sits on a D sharp and plays something that sounds like it goes to B and then B flat and then resolves back to D. Like, I remember on the end, on the end, there's a version of him playing "I've Got a Right to Sing the Blues" in D, and he ends it with that, but a little dot, and he hits this D sharp, and I was just like, wait a minute, what's going on? You know, like, and that's like in the 30s, right? So but I think Paul must have had some intuitive sense about that. And there's drummers are such great band leaders, man, and they're great composers.
Yeah, I love drummers and drummers compositions. That's like Bill Stewart, like, you know, you played with Bill. I mean, his tunes, man, that's like, wow, incredible.
We recorded one of them called
Souls.
I know.
Those,
you know, he had those 2 brilliant Blue Note records that are out of print, unfortunately, but one with Seamus Blake and I believe Steve Wilson, and one with Lovano and Eddie Henderson. And then there's the duo project
with Bill Carruthers. I love that stuff. That's incredible.
And then there's the trio project he has with Kevin Hayes and Larry Goldings, which is incredible. You know, Billy Drummond's a great band leader. Brian Blade, of course. My friend Quincy Davis, who I used to work with up in Canada, great writer, great band leader. So yeah, drummers, man. I always tell my drum students, like, man, learn your basics, because, you know, I mean, Blakey, Art Taylor,
Elvin,
Lewis, I mean, there's so many. Elvin, I mean, some of the all-time greatest band leaders for sure.
But you mentioned, you know, possibilities where you have the Bill Stewart tune. How did you hook up with Scofield, actually? And, you know, the album starts with Sco's Camp Out, actually, so which I love.
Right. And John said I should have started with Paradox, and in retrospect, I probably should have. What happened was there used to be an old Iridium up on like 63rd, like at the south end of Lincoln Center. I don't know. Have you been in New York before?
Yeah, sure. Many times, yeah.
Were you here back like 20 years ago or something?
I think I saw Scofield in 2001 in the Iridium, so it must have been the old one, maybe. Or was it the new one? I don't remember. But 2000.
The new one is on like Broadway in the 50s or something, like 52nd. But anyway, so I went to see Scofield, one of Scofield's bands. It must have been 98, I believe. And Larry Goldings was there, and I knew Larry from the Augies days, you know, that trio with Bill and Peter. Larry used to call me occasionally because he'd always have guests, you know, to be like usually a guest horn player with their steady, whatever it was, Thursdays or something. And I said hi to him. He said, "Hey man, you want to meet John?" I said, "I'd love to meet John." I was a huge fan. And I said, I just remember it was so funny. They were about to go on, and Larry said, "I'm just going to get a coffee." And Scofield said, "The man's his artist. The man's an artist. He knows what his needs are, you know, or something like that. So he knows his needs." So as Larry was going to get a cup of coffee, I said, "Man, I'm a huge fan. I would love to call you for a date sometime." He's like, "Sure, man. Just send me something. You know, I'll do it. I probably can't make a rehearsal, but," and he just was so,
Well,
I guess just the fact that Larry introduced me was enough. And I sent him something, and he got back to me, said, "Yeah, man, this sounds good. Let's do something." And I said, you know, just we'll work it out. I won't make a rehearsal, but you know, I'll be there in the studio. And so we did a day, and yeah, and he was so great, you know, and I was so thankful, and great band, you know, with Peter Washington and Bill and Kevin Hayes. So I saw Kevin recently. He did a master class at our school a couple months ago, and we've been friends since we were teenagers. And I, you know, super
fantastic.
Yeah, just super proud of him and love what he does. So.
How speaking of those records, like how did you get bands together, or decide for a group? You know, like Currents, Monder, Scott Colley, Bill Stewart, Ed Simon. I mean, that's like a dream lineup, or you know, or possibilities. Or how did you decide for a group usually?
I think Currents was Larry Grenadier, wasn't it?
Was Larry? Oh shit!
I think I
got it wrong.
I have to check. I mean, I know the. Well, I had sort of a steady group with Charlap and Tim Horner and Sean Smith. So that was one, like in the 90s. So we did a couple of gigs. We played like the Ottawa Jazz Festival. We did a jazz cruise, played a couple things in New York. And so that was one of the records that I recorded with Jerry Teekins. The first thing came about, the first record, Ask Me Now, came about like 2 or 3 days ahead of time. I was really sick too, and I sounded, but I had like a fever, and that was a rough one. But I was playing with Tim Hagen's with Maria, and I loved Tim.
Well, Tim is amazing.
And then I just, you know, and boy, Larry Grenadier and Bill, man, wow, like, you know, I mean, Billy Drummond, and then Charlap made that, and I had wanted to do a date with LaDon because he was the guy that got me on Jerry Teekins' radar, you know, from being a sideman on Soulmates, and so we wound up. That was one of the Jamie Abersol Jr. Double Time projects. The things we need.
Yeah,
was from a title of Barry Harris's, and. So, and I was playing with T.S. Monk around that time, and Ronnie Matthews was in that band, and I never heard anybody play Monk's music like Ronnie. And and just to be completely honest with you, a lot of those tunes really were kicking my ass. I was just like, one of the first gigs I ever did, Ronnie was like, "You know this tune, Skippy?" I'm like, "No," and he said, "Toot." They called T.S. It was just his birthday. They used to call him Toot, Little Rudy Tootie. That's Toot, you know. And Don Sickler, you know, I said, "Toot, Don, let's do that one. And you take the first solo, John." And I just, because you know that tune.
Yeah, I know, and I know it now. Yeah, sir. So
first of all, the way Monk's changes move with those dominant chords, right? Like it's a completely different kind of thing. Like his whole harmonics is completely different. It was years before I even realized that was a reharm on T for 2. You know, that's his reharm on T for 2, and then his contrafact on those changes. But so, and then I got, you know, you get in the last 8 bars, and there's 1 chord per beat, and I'm looking at, and I just took the horn out of my mouth and said, you know, basically, you know, some language I will not share, and looked over at Ronnie, and Ronnie almost fell off the piano bench laughing at me. He literally was laughing the whole rest of the tune. You know, it's kind of like, "All right, young fella, you better stay humble," you know. And I was like, yeah, I'm a lot of humility because I don't know how to play this shit. So, but I loved working with him and what he had to offer. And I told him one night, I said, "Man, like the way you play Monk's music is it's just so incredible. He said, thanks, man. I really appreciate that. He said, but I got the compliment of a lifetime a few years ago when Nelly told me the same thing. Because,
Wow.
Thelonious's, Toot's mom, Nelly, Thelonious's, wife,
Yeah.
would come and hang out with us, particularly if we were in New York or Jersey. And she was super nice, And she was there, I think I said that to him. We played like a New Year's Eve gig in Jersey one night. And I said that to him. He said, well, that was the compliment of a lifetime. And man, it was deep, because I think sometimes people approach that music and they try to do some corny, like, I'm going to plunk some seconds or something. And like, no, that ain't it. Like, but the time feel and the touch, like somebody like Barry Harris or Ronnie really understood that, so.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah.
But anyways, to answer your question, it was just all the different musicians that I was around listening to and playing with saying, hey man, like you want to do.
Yeah.
And there was one, the record I did with LaDon, I wrote a tune called Stapleton because Kenny Washington and I are both from the same neighborhood, Stapleton on Staten Island. And he's 10 years older than me, but we knew some people in common, and his brother Reggie's an electric bass player. And
Sure, yeah.
so we went to the same elementary school 10 years apart by the Stapleton projects and all that. So
that's incredible. Yeah. John, also, we mentioned that before. Later, you'll send me the book and I'll pay through PayPal that the jazz dialogues interviews. I really want to read that.
Don't worry about that. It's on Amazon, but we'll work something out. I can, yeah.
No, but we will. But how did you? Today you're on the other side. But like, how did you decide to do this interviews? You obviously you love the jazz history and the respect for these musicians, but like, what made you start investigating musicians?
Well, basically, it was through ArtistShare because I remember Maria Schneider telling me about. She didn't tell me what it was, but she said, Brian. She was friends with Brian Camilio, and she said Brian's got this idea. It's going to completely change the scene, and it's going to be really cool. I can't tell anybody what it is. I said okay. And then a couple of years later, I turn on the Grammys and I see her holding a Grammy for the first record not released in stores. That was maybe 2003. And then the next year, 2004, Tower Records closed. And I just remember as a kid, like the big thing, wow, if you're in Tower Records and you got a little slot with your name, like that would be the really cool thing. And it's like, so I had like a little slot with my name for whatever it was, 12 years, and now it's gone. It's like, okay, so now what can I try? So I thought, let me go into, try to deal with ArtistShare. And when I called Brian Camilio, he said, well, other than the CDs, other than the recordings, what would you do? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we're looking to create content, like educational content. Like we would encourage you to create some lessons. I was like, oh, okay. And so I did that, and they coached me a little bit because I was not super tech savvy. I would not consider myself extremely tech savvy. I'm a lot more literate at this point, of course, as we all have to be. Sure. But at the time, like I didn't even own a computer. Like I went and got a computer. So like, that's where I was, like late 2005, early 2006 or whatever. And they said, well, what about like talking with musicians? Like, oh, like interviews. I said, yeah, I could just talk with like, my friends and my heroes and my teachers and my mentors. And I would love to do that. And so like, I did like a dozen, Eddie Locke, Phil Woods, Charlotte, Maria, I don't know, Scott Robinson. I did one with Lauren Schoenberg that didn't come out. I should maybe talk with Lauren again at some point. And then I started, so what happened was I was going to so I just put that up on the ArtistShare site for a while. My current ArtistShare website is frankly very old and certain things don't work and it needs to be updated. So you can't really access that. It came with certain projects that people would buy access to. You get the whole experience, you wouldn't just get the CD. So that was the genesis of that, was just like coming up with something other than just the recordings. But then I really got into it. And I was enjoying it a lot. And then I thought, like, I had to go back to school and do a master's degree. At least I just knew that was something I wanted to do. I needed to do basically to kind of solidify getting a teaching gig that would help me take care of my kids and all that kind of stuff. So I thought this could be a doctoral thesis. And so I actually spoke with several colleges about the possibility of doing a doctoral degree, and this series of interviews with jazz musicians and stories from the road. And but I think it was my vision, and what I was really passionate about with it was too wide open. You know, it was going to be like, what were things that were important to the development of Eddie Locke as a jazz musician, and Phil Woods, and Maria Schneider, and Mark Turner, and this diverse group of musicians, you know, and they're like, no, you have to talk about, like, you have to do, you know, in-depth research on why, like, this one guy at one school, he said, I'll give you two possible things. Why did tenor players in New York prefer 3.5 ricos to 3 ricos in 1973? Discuss.
Oh my God.
And I said, I can't. I can't. He said, I'll give you another one. Jazz journalism in the late 60s was jive. Discuss. And I just said, if the word jive is in anything that I ever do, it's over. Like, let me just call it a life and jump off a bridge. Aside from the fact that this is not something I'm passionate about. So to be fair, the people that were giving me examples like that have a valid point about the process of research.
Yeah.
Like, you know, so I understand that, right? But I just thought, if I'm going to pursue this, I got to do the same thing I do as a musician. What's meaningful to me, and what do I hope will be meaningful to other people? And so I took the artist share thing, and I'm like, well, let me just keep doing it. And when I kind of got the door, like, was kind of closing on the possibility of doing that, and I spoke with some good people. I mean, Mincer at USC was like, he's like, man, I'm down. I think he was open to it. But the people that ran the schools and stuff, they were, you know what I mean? I think they didn't like the sound of it, and I do understand why, you know. So then I thought, well, maybe I'll do a book at some point. I was going to take a sabbatical in the second half of 2020. We know what happened the second half, you know, in March of 2020. I was supposed to do a whole bunch of touring, and I was hoping to do another recording, and that got put off a year. Obviously, it became Stranger Than Fiction. I thought, well, let me try to do something creative and turn this thing into a book. And that's what happened. So, it was fun. You know, I mean, there are certain things. I think it's a different perspective, you know, when you're talking with friends, and you know, certain people are like family. I mean, Phil Woods was like a father to me. You know, Charlap's like a brother to me. I mean, so, but Eddie Locke was like a father to me. You know, a lot of, you know, they really were, and that's why I say I had a lot of great people. Charles McPherson was incredibly, like, he's one of my musical fathers too, and you know, for what it's worth, man, if there's a Jazz Masters thing that they keep doing, and I hope that they do, he should be, in my opinion,
he's so underrated. So underrated.
You know, and a very important contributor. And I never heard anybody play the alto any deeper than what I heard in the 80s and 90s with Charles. One of the all-time, to me, one of the great alto players I've ever heard. And another one, great composer, man. Great composer. I really grew up on a lot of his tunes, sitting at the piano with a tear and a smile, and, you know, certain pieces that he wrote that I found very inspirational. So
beautiful. Yeah, cool. We'll I need the book.
I'll get you a copy.
I love reading this stuff. You know, that's why I'm doing these interviews. Just you know, you learn so much also by listening to other musicians, and just, you know, it's part of a history, and creating like some sort of an archive for others. And I think that's really important what we do. So
I agree. And I think, you know, I think it's important hearing from the musicians themselves, you know. And them being able to say what they want to say, rather than like maybe an interviewer. You know, I wanted them to be like, you know, this, because I remember saying to a couple of people, you know, I said, well, I sent everything to the musician. Like, are you cool with everything you said? Because in this day and age, it's like you can say the wrong thing or whatever. And whatever. And you know, we hope that we all offer grace to people and will receive it if needed, if we, but I wanted everybody like, are you okay with this? So that was important to me because I wanted it to be what the musicians wanted her,
Yeah, that's my goal also, actually. So yeah, but John, man, just to finish, like, what are the plans for 2023? I mean,
well, that sabbatical that I didn't take a couple of years ago, I'm taking now. I'm going. I had a very busy December. I'm in Illinois at the moment. My girlfriend has a beautiful home here. I was just in New York until the 24th. I'll be back in New York in a couple of days. Then I'm going to Honolulu for a week. I'm doing actually a conference, a humanities and arts conference, where I'm going to present the book. Done this kind of thing a few times. And then I'm going to do a couple of clinics and gigs while I'm there. Some great friends, marvelous classical saxophone players, Alan Wan and Todd Yukamoto, that are good old friends, and they're hooking me up with that. Got a West Coast tour. We mentioned Alan Ferber. I know Mark Ferber and I are doing some things in California in March, and I may be doing some stuff with Alan. And earlier that month, they're out there. We're not completely sure. I'm going to be in Europe in May, and a few gigs in New York along the way. January 11th, I'll be at Bar Bayou, and then I'm going to be recording this next large ensemble project somewhere late summer, early fall, back up in Canada.
Fantastic.
And that's
quite busy, man. That's a lot. Yeah.
It's So man, really nice to meet you. And
you too.